I ask myself, or we ask ourselves in classroom, how could we now work with these capabilities actually if we were to describe a literacy engagement? So instead of looking at our own literacy engagement and actually directly answer your question for your assignment one, what we did instead, because we had to actually work towards assignment 2 as well, so instead of just basically directly addressing what we think would be the right activity to describe, the right activities to describe for assignment 2, we actually look at the context of classroom. And what we did, I'll just take this task here. What we did, we looked at remember that last week we had a look at the Latin American singer on the X Factor and how he was using two different languages in order to actually relate to the audience. So we thought to ourselves, okay, how can we engage all these, how can we work with the map that we have here that allows us to talk about different aspects of literacy engagement? How can we work with this map if we were to talk about an activity, like for example, engage children in a talent context, right? So how could we do it? Now, how can we design, or what is needed from the perspective of all these capabilities and maybe social, cultural, and symbolic capital? What is required? How can we use those terms, those abstract terms, in order to see what an activity like creating a talent contest in your school, what it would require? So the first thing we did, if we were to think of this talent contest, we had to somehow first think that it had to actually somehow refer back to cross-curricular priorities, which means Asian engagement, so the relationships between Asia and Australia, sustainability, indigenous histories and cultures. So instantly we thought that the talent contest, what kinds of talents will it target? You know, what kinds of things we would actually support or showcase. And then we thought, well, if it is to actually be culturally sensitive and also responsive to the cross-curricular priorities, it has to actually reflecting awareness of Asian, indigenous, and of Asian cultures, of indigenous cultures and knowledges, right? And it also would be good if it, and as a result, it would also be good that it actually has some community orientation. So not only maybe because it involves Asian culture and knowledges or indigenous, but also somehow the talent contest is about building a community, right? We always want to build community, because if we through our units of work build communities, we enable children and our students to grow an understanding of how a community in Australia, because we're talking about when talking about Australia, but it could be in other countries because we have students from different countries. So how a local community actually looks like, how it works, and how can we work with those different community groups in order to actually support everyone, support the relationships between school and the community, and support the other community and support the communities themselves, because communities actually get alive and get enriched when they collaborate with other groups. So schools benefit when they collaborate with different um, local and non-local communities. So schools life, schools curricula get enriched, but at the same time the other groups get enriched. It's a two-way thing. So okay, so we've solved the cross-curricular priorities. We knew that we will be targeting an activity in a way that makes room for uh, community engagement and at the same time kinds of talents that are not just the typical, what is for us typical Western talents, that they also include talents that are relevant and are practiced in Asia and they practice in indigenous communities, and they not necessarily that familiar to Anglo people or people from Europe. So that's lovely. So we've got the cross-curricular priorities fixed, an activity that is pitched at the level but is not actually myopic, it's actually quite expensive, so we're very happy. The question was then in classroom, how do we engage, what is it that's needed in order for this activity to be successful? What's needed in terms of social and personal capabilities, ethical and cultural, and critical and creative? Well, if you actually, once again, look at these concepts, so what's needed, what capabilities, say for example from the perspective of social capability and personal, what is it that you need to consider when you design a talent concept in order to, pardon me, that was the solution, in order to engage the social and personal capability. So what do you do? Um, you use talents that enable children to express emotions appropriately. You use activities teaching children that enable them to develop self-discipline and set goals. You see my point? It is a little bit ambiguous, isn't it? Like we have those adjectives and we could use them, or I call them adjectives, but they are just descriptors of the capability. And when we talk about our own engagement, literacy engagement, we could actually sort of use them, and that's great. But if we were now to be increasingly orderly and test our understanding of these capabilities in relation to our little activity, which is here, it gets a bit difficult because what do we do with all these descriptors? We want children to get involved in a talent contest, and at the same time we want the talent contest as a learning activity, make children appreciate diverse perspectives, contribute to civil society. Okay, it's getting now a bit messy. It is getting a bit messy. So what do we do? And this is why I actually included the social capital. Okay, so that's here, the social and cultural capital. I use Bourdieu because he's smart. He's a big professor. Actually, he has died. He had cancer, but he's a big professor. He was a big professor in France. He has changed the way sociology is now practiced. So he has changed the entire field of sociology. He's given direction. He's given terminology. So I thought if the guy was that smart and literacy is about people, so therefore the sociological terms are important, I thought why don't we just actually see how these different forms of capital can help us to create or to start planning our activity, which is talent contest. So we now know that it has to be high pitched, right? We've got this pitch here. But how do we integrate all these reflective and critical and broad thinking and creative, all of that? So when we look actually at these adjectives here, which I could produce, is social. So for example, when we create a talent context, I keep forgetting here to actually replace those drafty points of focus, right? So if we were to, so we copy this one and paste, and we put it here to make sure that you know that this descriptor of our activity draws on the cross-curricular priorities, right? So in order to have the understanding of engagement of the Asian cultures, indigenous cultures, and also for the activity to have community orientation, right? So that's from the cross-curricular priorities. But then when we think of the social, personal, ethical, and what I did here, I have produced a little bit of a matrix. Um, this is, you don't need that. You can actually for yourselves one day maybe read it, but this is too complicated and it's not necessarily relevant for us. It's just too higher order of social description. Okay, so social capital. So if we were to actually create a talent contest event, what are the things that we need to think of? And I'm saying you don't solve them all yourselves. As teachers, you actually engage your students in the planning, because as you engage your students in the planning of a talent contest event, they actually learn a lot of things. So we've done a number of things. Social capital, I have thought to myself, well, if social and personal capabilities are about self-awareness and also awareness of other people and how they feel, and also working with people, learning how to work with people, I thought we could actually, the social capital will, in relation to this capability, will ask you who to engage, right? Who should we, who should a reflect a who should your students engage in their talent contest? So basically, who should be their audience? Because X Factor has an audience. You don't just sing, because that's sort of weird. You can do it at home. If you actually have a talent contest, you want some audience. So the question then is, whom do you engage? Who's gonna be there? Who will be the audience? So that's very interesting. So the children can think a little bit about it, but what would be good if you actually expand it? So we might actually color these as different from the other capabilities, right? Social capital. I wonder what will happen here. Cultural and symbolic. Okay, so they belong to the personal and social capabilities. So the social capital will ask us, who would be the relevant audience, right? Who would be the relevant audience? So then next thing what we do, we engage children in activities which allow them to actually explore what that relevant audience would look like. So social capital gives us a focus, cultural capital gives us now a, a focus for creating activities through which you with children would explore what does a talent, what a school talent contest involves, what does it involve, and therefore children on the basis of it could actually make some guesses or make some create some understandings of what that audience should look like. And then, of course, obviously, once they know what the audience will be, then they can actually start thinking of whom to invite. So you can see how lovely. So this is the social, so this is in regard to personal. This would be in regard to ethical and intercultural. And I'll show you, we'll discuss it in detail. And this one will be in regard to critical and creative. So let us have a look now at so this is pretty clear, right? So why symbolic capital is always about the message that you are actually passing or actually projecting through your engagement of these different types of capital. So depending how you actually will be responding to it, who would be the relevant audience, right? If you actually pitch an event, a school event, which is not connected at the community, not oriented or oriented at the community, but a very narrow community. So the message would be that events for professional communities or for particular interest group communities might actually require different procedures than maybe an event like talent context, school talent context, which might actually be broader in terms of the participants or in terms of the audience than you actually might assume to begin with, right? So, okay, so the children are actually now with you, engaging in identifying what the event is, what does it involve, and therefore what type of people actually will be the audience that children will participate. So you can see that all these terms that we had before from the social and personal capability now actually acquire meaning. So once we look at them through these three different forms of capital, these three different forms of capital allow us to actually ask focused questions that are relevant to the event or to the purpose of the unit of work that we're creating, but at the same time they engage all the bullet points from the specific capability that we're actually addressing. They help us to address those bullet points at the same time as we are actually learning about um, learning to answer all these questions. So you can see that we gain a lot from these different forms of capital. Sorry, I got a little bit entangled because it's really hard to talk to myself. But anyway, so we've got different forms of capital. They give me or give us focus questions, and therefore give us a way through these focus questions to engage the capability, and in this case, the social and personal. Right, so children here learn, compare and contrast through these different questions. What does a school talent contest involve, and who would be, and the questions, who would be relevant audience. They actually learn about the community in relation to a particular activity, and therefore they contest their own expectations of what the talent contest would actually involve, and therefore they learn about, they expand their own world as they actually explore how the world looks like through this specific question, which is how to create a talent contest. Now, when we actually look at the ethical and intercultural, well, actually in class we suggested that maybe first we should look at the critical and creative maybe. So let's have a look. So once we actually know what type of audience, once we know that we need to actually identify what type of audience we need, right? So we explore actually, and we develop activities exploring what the school talent contest involves, and we're actually looking at it from the perspective of the audience. Actually, we also can do the following. We can actually engage in an activity that will help us to actually find the audience. So we now know that to a school talent, which is actually pitched at intercultural community and diverse community, because the school talent can be quite bright and diverse in terms of the range of talents and the range of people that will be participating. All right, so now the question we have is, how do we find all these people? So now we're actually addressing the critical and creative capability. Critical and creative because we actually want to gather information. We're learning about how to gather information, and therefore we're learning how, in relation to the question of how to find those communities. So in relation to how to find communities, we're learning tools which would allow us to do so. So we're not actually stopping. We're not stopping at the simple answer, or rather, we just get some parents or some, elderly from the community or whatever. We just basically go and type, in Google. We type in Google what our needs are. We can actually use Google Maps to explore who is in our community, what buildings are in the closest proximity to our school. We can actually find out that there is a city council, there's a tourism center, information, I think it's called tourism information tourist center, I don't know, something like that, I can't remember. Um, so every city has one, and every city information tourism center actually tells you what is happening in the community. They will know about the events, they will know about the different groups, different associations, and so on. And that might actually be relevant depending on what kinds of talents you will be displaying. Because if you display talents that have something to do with environmental issues, you know, people can do children can do amazing things when it comes to gardening or sustainability or you know, and maybe land care would be involved in it. You just don't know, depending on what sort of talents children might want to display as a result of the activities that they've done before. So depending on the talents they want to display, you might actually want to find what kind of groups in your community exist that you could actually invite. So you go to these different organizations, right? And you can actually, so social capital is that social capital here reflects the kind of social resources that we have, social and other technological resources that we have in order to tap into those different people and communities. We could also have here personal knowledge of different groups. I mean, people actually live in those communities. Very often children know of their existence, and they may actually. So these are the kinds of resources that at the social level a group has, or a city has, or a town has, which they can provide your children or your students with in order to actually find out who is in the community. So how to find out whom to engage. So these are the sort of things that we have available around our communities. Now, cultural capital. Cultural capital now here refers to the tools, capacities, so tools or capacities relevant for engaging these groups, right? So what would they be? So notice here it's tools or capacities relevant for engaging these groups, and in the social and personal capability we had what does a school talent contest involve. So they both kind of exploratory. What does a contest involve? And here is what do you have to have in order to actually make these connections with the information tourist center or city council. So you need to have particular things. You need to have internet. You have to have a capacity, personal capacity to engage community groups. Yeah, and the community groups could be anything I wrote here: Red Cross Center, HK centers, indigenous communities, load communities, which is the different languages other than English, parents as well. So the cultural capital of a community is reflected in those different groups and associations. And now in order to engage these people, you actually need to have particular skills, particular technologies that will enable you to actually reach out to these communities. So in terms of a symbolic capital, what this way of approaching the task of organizing a talent contest, what message does it actually send out to the community is that the event is not only for the community, but also you will be using community resources, right? So very strongly, now we have only analyzed two capabilities, which is the social and personal and critical and creative, very much that community orientation is coming through. First, we want to know what kind of community to invite, what does it, and first, and to find out, we need to actually learn about what the talent contest actually involves. And then we are learning about the different communities we do have in place, right? So we're learning it through the use of the capacities that are in the community. It could be our teachers, it could be our personal relationships, it could be through particular uh, services that are provided by the city or the internet, right? All of that. So these are so through different capacities. So these are the capacities. So different tools and capacities enable us to actually reach out to these different communities and learn when they meet, where they are, and so on, so that we could actually contact them and let them know about our event. So social capital, cultural capital, and symbolic capital in relation to critical and creative capabilities are all about finding out how we could actually engage the relevant communities, where they are, what is necessary for us to have to engage them. When we go now here to ethical and intercultural capabilities, actually I will just make it a bit more simple. It is all about the protocol of engagement, right? Because you can't just, people don't do things just because they want to. Sometimes they do, but sometimes we actually have to be a little bit more sensitive. We've got to be ethical and sensitive to the ways in which we actually reach out to people. And this is one of the tasks that I advise strongly that teachers actually take children through, so that children not only have the audience at the talent contest once they run it, but actually they worked very hard to get them there. So by the time they perform in front of the audience, they already have developed some form of understanding who these people are, maybe some form of relationships, because sometimes they might have actually gone out to give them invitations. They might have gone through a particular protocol that makes that doesn't just end or is not just limited to handing in a piece of paper with an invitation, but maybe there's an entire protocol involved. So the social capital allows us to ask questions about the protocol of engagement. What are the protocols? So you can actually show to children that there are different protocols for engaging different communities. You can show them little things like for birthday parties, how they actually engage people, or if someone, I don't know. So there are different events for which people have to front up, and you can show to them. You can think, I can't think of all of them now. So there are different events for which people have to front up, and you can create activities through which children can actually explore. But for different events, there are different forms of protocol. So now, for example, let's think of Information Tourism Center. So basically, they found out that in order to do a talent contest, and in order to do it in a way that addresses cross-curricular priorities, they will have a community there as an audience which is quite diverse in age and also ethnic and language background, and also maybe professional interests. Right, so that's quite a complex community. It's all fungi, so that could be the whole unit of work you could create before you even run preparation for a talent contest. Right, so this is just an entire unit created just to how to actually identify and invite the audience. So once they know the talent that they will have this diverse audience, and they have actually identified their addresses, identified where they are through all these activities, and now the idea is how to actually um, engage those different people. So for example, if they actually want to talk to some professional association like Land Care, or if they want to invite parents, or if they want to invite indigenous people, they might, with your help, actually invite representatives of these groups and think of the most suitable ways to do so. So now with parents, um, that might be easier, because what might happen is maybe your teacher will help children find out that parents actually have a meeting in the school, and children can actually hand in handmade invitations for parents. So that's sort of easier. Although you could actually make it a bit more complex and actually invite different parents from different cultural backgrounds, and they could actually teach children how to create invitations for people or for parents who represent the ethnic diversity of children of the classroom children. So if we have Vietnamese children, they'll have Vietnamese parents. They might have Filipino, they might have indigenous parents. So that would be very interesting to actually invite parents to help you to help your children to actually create invitations which have some form of ethnic um, and cultural, therefore, um, indicators. And in this way children learn that invitation is just not invitations. They have to be aesthetically pleasing, that's for sure. But in order to be aesthetically pleasing, it's because aesthetics is a cultural sort of phenomenon. What would be good to actually have some interculturally aware symbols on them, so that they're done nicely. And I mean, I'm not that fluent in those cultural artifacts, but you can imagine that those Japanese, for example, forms of invitations, or even Vietnamese, the Vietnamese will have a wonderful ornamentation, but Japanese might be actually folded in those interesting ways, and children will learn how to create these folding figures and all of that. That would be really lovely. It's a lovely activity. So now, with indigenous parents, maybe we could actually, through the parents, or the parents might actually, you can, with the parents, um, uh, contact relevant indigenous maybe organizations. And so not just with indigenous parents, you might actually think of how you can create indigenously invitations which are sensitive to indigenous values and indigenous ornamentation. But at the same time, you might actually, either through your indigenous officer or through your indigenous parents, you might actually contact also indigenous associations, so that you can actually bring in a person from um, a indigenous council, or I don't know, those organizations your indigenous officer will know. And those people might actually uh, teach your children how to talk to the indigenous community, and how to produce a form of or a protocol. How these people can actually teach your children how to produce maybe an invitation that is in a way that reflects actually an indigenous protocol. And so if you actually engage with those people, so what happens is there's a two-way investment you create. You create an investment that your children are learning about indigenous cultures, indigenous ways of expressing, um, of of expression which are relevant to the task of invitation, but also the indigenous people are investing in your children, and therefore the likelihood of some of them appearing at your event is quite high because they were part of the process of the preparation for the event. Now, I want to finish here because it's quite a lot of learning for this week, but you can see why we use this concept of capital. So I might just, so basically for each of the capabilities, I used here the concept of cultural capital, pardon me, of social, cultural, and symbolic capital in order to help us in identifying questions which will enable us to address each of the capabilities, right? To address in each of the capabilities. And in this way, what we did, we got some order, right? We're no longer thinking personal capability. How do we engage personal capability in the context of creating a talent contest? Self-awareness, managing of other people's emotions and all of that. Oh my God, how do you do that? It's very simple. If we have particular focus questions, we can actually create activities quite simply. And that's why I wanted those different types of capital, because they orient us to different activities relevant for each of the capabilities. Now, for the assignment purpose, none of this has to be done perfectly, right? I just want you to use these tools for describing. Now here what we did a classroom activity, right? But you could actually now replace it with an activity which reflects your literacy engagement, like for example, using Facebook, right? And now if you actually were to talk about not necessarily your ways of using Facebook, but a full-fledged person who is a person who's whose literacy skills are full-fledged and just really skilled in literacy-wise. How would a person like this use their literacy skills in relation to Facebook, or maybe make it broader, social media? And you can see how this kind of question, if actually unraveled in relation to the capabilities and those bullet points, and in relation to these different points of focus, how an activity of this kind can be described in quite a detail if you have a map, if you have some sort of hooks in relation to which you describe your literacy engagement. Doesn't have to be many, it could be just one. Provided you describe it in quite a detail, then all you have to do in assignment 1 is give me one example of your literacy engagement. But if you do it in a detail that reflects, that actually talks to the curriculum here, or to these higher order skills, then I can see that you know how to actually map the concept of literacy against the curriculum in relation to yourself. And I will know that then when we progress to assignment 2, it will be easy to translate now all of this into an activity for supporting children's reading. We kind of started it a little bit today, as you can see, but I hope that this sort of makes it more clear. And because it's a very new concept, these different forms of capital, they are very new concept. So I don't expect perfection, but I do hope that they will maybe inspire you to think of those capabilities in a way that kind of systematic, that you can, in a way that enables you to actually systematically address those capabilities rather than panic. Because there are so many aspects in each of these capabilities that really, it's really hard to address them all, or many of them, or any of them, really, in a way that is orderly, like somehow connected and make sense in relation to the theme of the literacy engagement, like be it a contest, talent contest, or engagement of social contest, or engagement of the social media, right? Whatever it would be. So what I would like you to do on LearnLine is start developing your portfolio. So page 1 would be a nice concept of literacy, and page 2, which would be about describing your literacy engagement. I would like you to actually start doing this by engaging all these abstract concepts. Once you start thinking abstractly about the concept of literacy, it will be easier for you to learn how to actually devise literacy activities or construct literacy units of work, um, because you'll be getting increasingly fluent with those abstract terms. So you as teachers, you learn abstract terms about literacy, and then you as teachers, you will be actually teaching children to think abstractly about how to think about literacy, right? So that's very important, because you will need as teachers to actually teach children how to think abstractly, and without actually you yourselves going through an exercise of this kind, it's really, really hard. And abstractly, what it means by ordering things in larger groups and seeing connections, right? That's why a model like this, it's a little bit hard to find. That's so it's hard to find, because people find it difficult to actually think at the level of abstraction high enough to actually create such relationships and actually pass them on to pre-service teachers. Anyway, I hope this was very helpful. I hope this description here will be helpful to you in thinking about your own literacy engagement and describing them. As I said, one literacy engagement is good enough provided it is well enough described. Okay? So I think I will finish here, and I'll see you on LearnLine.